The photograph had been catalogued, archived, and forgotten like thousands of others. A rectangular moment of soot and steel, German workers lined in rigid rows outside a factory gate, their faces worn smooth by labor and obedience. At first glance, nothing felt unusual. Men in identical coats, boots dark with oil, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the camera, as if trained not to look directly at whoever held it. History loved images like this, orderly, silent, unquestioning. But photographs have a way of betraying their secrets when stared at too long. The longer the image was studied, the more the symmetry began to collapse. Faces blurred into one another, not from motion, but from something like hesitation. As if the men hadn't been sure whether they were allowed to exist in that moment. Their hands were uniformly placed at their sides, behind their backs, folded neatly in front. All except one. He stood near the center, almost deliberately placed so the eye would pass over him without stopping. His arms were crossed. Not casually, not defensively, but with a stillness that felt rehearsed. His posture broke the rhythm of obedience, a single wrong note in a mechanical chorus. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't scowling. He was waiting. The shadows beneath the workers fell clean and straight, except his. His shadow leaned slightly toward the camera, stretching forward in a way the light source did not permit. The men beside him appeared subtly distorted, as if the space around him resisted being photographed. Records claimed the image was taken during a routine shift change. No incident, no deaths, no disruptions. Yet the factory itself was shut down 3 weeks later, its workforce reassigned, its name quietly removed from regional ledgers. And when the photograph was enlarged further, another detail emerged. Something that caused a pause, a tightening in the chest. Several workers seemed to be looking not at the camera, but at the man with crossed arms. Their expressions were not neutral. They were afraid. And the man at the center appeared to know, with absolute certainty, that one day someone would finally notice him. The photograph surfaced the way most forgotten things do, quietly, without ceremony, tucked inside a mislabeled archive drawer that smelled of dust and cold metal. It was catalogued as routine industrial documentation. German factory workers, early 20th century, standing shoulder to shoulder outside a brick building whose windows reflected nothing but pale sky. At first glance, it was painfully ordinary. Rows of men in heavy coats, caps pulled low, boots aligned with almost military precision. Their faces carried the same exhausted neutrality, the kind produced by long hours and learned silence. Nothing about the image suggested importance, let alone danger, yet something compelled a second look. The symmetry was too perfect. The workers stood as if arranged, not by chance, but by instruction, bodies squared, gazes forward, hands positioned in identical restraint. It felt less like a group photo, and more like a roll call frozen mid-breath. The longer the photograph was observed, the more that order began to feel oppressive, as though deviation itself had been edited out of existence. That was when the man with crossed arms revealed himself. He wasn't placed at the edge, where oddities often hide. He stood close to the center, surrounded on all sides by compliance. His coat matched the others. His face carried the same weathered pallor, but his arms were folded across his chest, cutting a sharp, defiant line through the uniformity. It wasn't a casual stance. There was no slouch, no relaxation. His posture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he had chosen that moment to break an unspoken rule. What unsettled most was not the gesture itself, but how wrong it felt in context. The other men looked trained, conditioned, to stand a certain way. Their bodies obeyed something unseen. His did not. He did not lean toward the camera, nor away from it. He did not seek attention. He simply stood there, self-contained, closed off, as if the photograph had captured him in the middle of refusing something no one else could see. Once noticed, it became impossible to ignore him. The eye returned again and again to that crossed posture, to the subtle tension in his shoulders. Even the men beside him seemed affected, their expressions faintly strained, their stares angled ever so slightly in his direction. It created the uncomfortable impression that everyone in the image was aware of him, except the viewer, who had arrived too late to understand why he mattered. The photograph no longer felt like a record of labor, but a moment of quiet disruption, preserved without explanation, waiting decades for someone to finally ask why one man had dared to stand differently, and what it had cost him to do so. Once the man with crossed arms had been noticed, the photograph began to resist passive viewing. Details that had seemed fixed and factual loosened under scrutiny, as if the image objected to being examined too closely. The workers' faces, when enlarged, showed a peculiar softness at the edges, not the blur of motion, but the distortion of something unresolved. It was as though the camera had struggled to decide where one expression ended and another began, smearing identity across the surface of the print. The shadows were worse. Light in the photograph appeared to come from a high, leftward angle, consistent with the time of day recorded in the archive. Most shadows obeyed this logic, falling neatly behind boots and along the brickwork. But around the man with crossed arms, the rules bent. His shadow angled forward, stretching toward the camera, darker and more defined than it should have been. It overlapped the shadows of the men beside him, creating a layered effect that implied depth where none should exist. The longer it was studied, the more it resembled an intrusion rather than a consequence of light. Other inconsistencies emerged slowly, like flaws in glass revealed only when tilted just right. The space around the crossed arms man appeared slightly warped. The men closest to him seemed subtly elongated, their proportions altered by a fraction that the mind noticed before it could articulate. Buttons on coats misaligned, a cap brim curved unnaturally. The brick pattern behind him lost its rhythm, lines bending inward as though the building itself recoiled from his presence. Most unsettling of all were the eyes. Individually, the workers appeared expressionless, but together they formed a pattern that only became clear when compared side by side. Several gazes were not directed toward the camera, as initially assumed, but angled toward the center. Not openly, not in a way that could be called obvious, but enough to suggest awareness. A shared tension. A silent acknowledgement of something that should not have been happening. Technical explanations failed to settle the unease. Age-related degradation could account for some distortions, but not their consistency. The anomalies clustered around one figure, radiating outward in diminishing intensity. It was as if the photograph had been forced to accommodate him, stretching and compressing reality to make room for a presence that did not belong within its frame. Repeated examinations produced a strange psychological effect. The longer the image was studied, the harder it became to focus on any single worker. Attention slid, inevitably, back to the crossed arms, to the sense that the man was not merely captured by the photograph, but actively shaping it. Viewers reported an inexplicable feeling of being watched, not by the man himself, but by the space around him, as though the photograph remembered every pair of eyes that lingered too long, and beneath all of it lay a growing certainty that the irregularities were not accidents or errors, but signals. Subtle distortions left behind by something that had briefly intersected with the visible world and refused to leave cleanly. The search for answers moved away from the photograph and into the brittle silence of records and ledgers, where history was supposed to clarify what images could not. Factory logs from the period were retrieved, their pages yellowed, ink faded but legible. According to official documentation, the day the photograph was taken had been entirely uneventful. Shift changes were recorded, production quotas met, no accidents reported. It was the kind of day that left no mark, the sort administrators prized because it required no explanation. Yet the absence itself began to feel deliberate. Payroll sheets listed names that did not align with the number of men visible in the image. Some surnames appeared twice, others were missing entirely, replaced by blank lines that suggested erasure rather than oversight. A separate attendance book, stored in a different archive, showed corrections scratched out with heavy strokes, ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. Dates around the photograph's timestamp were intact, but that specific day carried a strange weight, as if handled more often than the rest. Correspondence between factory supervisors hinted at disruption without naming it. Brief notes referenced adjustments and necessary silence, phrases that read like euphemisms when taken out of context. One memo ended abruptly mid-sentence, the remainder of the page left empty, as though the writer had reconsidered the act of committing words to paper. Another mentioned a temporary reassignment of workers, yet no destination was ever specified. Municipal records were no more helpful. Injury reports, which were meticulously maintained in that era, skipped directly from the previous week to the next. No explanation. No amendments. Even the local newspaper, known for documenting the smallest industrial mishap, carried nothing. It was as if the entire shift had passed through the day without existing in it. Their labor performed, but their presence denied. The factory itself told a different story. Maintenance logs noted unusual structural stress in the days following the photograph, hairline fractures in walls that had stood solid for decades. Equipment inspections cited inexplicable wear, machinery behaving as if it had been pushed beyond human limits. None of this was attributed to any incident. The language remained cautious, evasive, engineered to avoid implication. Most troubling was the sudden dispersal of the workforce. Within weeks, departments were dissolved, workers reassigned or released with minimal documentation. Some names vanished from employment records altogether, never appearing in other factories or census data. There were no death certificates, no relocation papers, no trace of continuity. It was as though the men had stepped out of history at the end of a shift and failed to return. When the photograph was reconsidered in this context, it no longer seemed like a harmless snapshot. It became the only surviving evidence that those men had been there at all, a visual contradiction to the written record. And at the center of that contradiction stood the man with crossed arms, positioned not just among the workers, but at the fault line between what was documented and what had been deliberately removed. The search widened beyond the original factory, driven by the uneasy sense that the photograph was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a pattern waiting to be uncovered. Archives in neighboring regions were examined, then collections farther afield, their contents combed for visual echoes rather than names. It was a slow, obsessive process, comparing faces, postures, and backgrounds that history insisted were unrelated. Most images revealed nothing. Rows of workers, soldiers, clerks, countless men captured in moments meant to be forgettable. Then the posture appeared again. In a photograph dated years later, taken outside a different factory hundreds of miles away, the same stance emerged near the center of the frame, arms crossed, shoulders squared. The clothing had changed with the era, the backdrop unmistakably different, yet the posture was identical, precise down to the angle of the elbows. The man's face bore an unsettling familiarity, not because it matched perfectly, but because it refused to show age. Lines that should have deepened did not. The eyes carried the same distant patience, the same impression of waiting. At first, coincidence was the preferred explanation. Industrial photography often repeated compositions, and human similarity was a comforting excuse. But as more images surfaced, coincidence lost its credibility. The man appeared in photographs taken decades apart, sometimes closer to the edge, sometimes near the center, but always present. His arms were never at his sides, never folded behind his back, always crossed, as if that single gesture defined his existence. In each image, the surrounding figures showed subtle signs of disturbance. Averted gazes, tension in posture, occasionally a blur where a face should have been clear, as though the camera hesitated. The environments themselves seemed to react warped lines, inconsistent shadows, a faint sense of compression around the man's position. Different cameras, different photographers, the same visual discomfort repeating itself with unnerving consistency. Attempts to identify him through facial recognition yielded nothing conclusive. Measurements aligned too closely to dismiss, yet no name could be attached. Census records offered no anchor. Military drafts, employment rolls, residence permits, all silent. It was as if the man existed only at the moment of documentation and dissolved immediately afterward, leaving no administrative residue. The most disturbing discovery came from a photograph believed lost for years, recovered from a private collection. It showed a group of workers staring directly at the camera, their expressions strained. At the center stood the familiar figure, arms crossed, his gaze fixed not on the lens, but slightly beyond it. When compared to earlier images, his face was unchanged. Not younger, not older, timeless in a way that defied the slow erosion all faces endure. By then, the pattern was undeniable. The man was not moving through time as others did. He was appearing within it, momentarily intersecting with human routines before slipping back out. Each photograph became less a record and more a warning, a repeated imprint of something that did not belong to any single era, patiently placing itself where it could be seen, waiting for someone to finally understand that his refusal to age was not a mystery, but a consequence. The final realization did not arrive with a sudden revelation, but with a slow, suffocating certainty that settled in the mind and refused to leave. The man with crossed arms was never an act of rebellion frozen in time, never a symbol of defiance as history liked to frame such gestures. His posture was not resistance but restraint, a deliberate stillness chosen over movement. He was not standing against something. He was waiting for something to happen. The moment this understanding took shape, the photographs changed again. They no longer felt like passive records, but like invitations that had gone unanswered for decades. The man's repeated presence across time was not an accident of documentation, but an attempt at continuity. Each image marked a point where he had placed himself to be seen, trusting that eventually someone would notice the pattern and complete whatever exchange had been left unfinished. The consequences of noticing him became apparent through scattered accounts that had once been dismissed as stress or imagination. Archivists reported lingering unease after prolonged study, a sense of being followed long after leaving the reading room. Some claimed the photographs appeared different upon return visits. The man's position subtly altered, his shadow creeping closer to the edge of the frame. Others described dreams in which factory yards stretched endlessly, workers standing in silence while a single figure waited at the center, arms crossed, patient and unmoving. It became clear that recognition was not a neutral act. To truly see him was to acknowledge whatever boundary he occupied between presence and erasure. The men who vanished from records were no longer viewed as victims of bureaucratic omission, but as collateral, caught too close to something unresolved. Their disappearance was not the result of violence or catastrophe, but of proximity, of standing near a moment that refused to settle into the past. The man himself remained unchanged, not because he was immune to time, but because he was anchored to the act of being observed. Each photograph functioned as a temporary seal, holding him in place until attention wore thin and he slipped free again. He did not age because he was not living forward. He was suspended, dependent on witnesses to maintain his form. The most disturbing implication was the simplest one. The photographs had endured because they were looked at, shared, archived, and rediscovered. Each viewing renewed the connection, however faint. To stop noticing him, to let the image fade back into obscurity, might have been the only way to close whatever loop he occupied, but the human instinct to examine, to uncover meaning, ensured that would never happen. In the end, the man with crossed arms did not seek to escape the photograph or step into the world. He waited for recognition because recognition was the exchange, the moment when someone finally understood that by seeing him clearly, they were offering themselves as the next point of continuity, another place for him to stand, arms crossed, preserved not in paper and silver, but in memory.